Wuthering Heights, Chapter 10. A charming introduction to a hermit's life. 4 weeks' torture, tossing, and sickness. Oh, these bleak winds and bitter northern skies, and impassable roads and dilatory country surgeons. And oh, this dearth of the human physiognomy, and worse than all, the terrible intimation of Kenneth that I need not expect to be out of doors till spring. Mr. Heathcliff has just honored me with a call. About 7 days ago he sent me a brace of grouse, the last of the season. Scoundrel! He is not altogether guiltless in this illness of mine, and that I had a great mind to tell him. But alas, how could I offend a man who was charitable enough to sit at my bedside a good hour and talk on some other subject than pills and draughts, blisters and leeches? This is quite an easy interval. I am too weak to read, yet I feel as if I could enjoy something interesting. Why not have up Mrs. Dean to finish her tale? I can recollect its chief incidents as far as she had gone. Yes, I remember her hero had run off and never been heard of for 3 years, and the heroine was married. I'll ring. She'll be delighted to find me capable of talking cheerfully. Mrs. Dean came. It wants 20 minutes, sir, to taking the medicine, she commenced. Away, away with it, I replied. I desire to have... The doctor says you must drop the powders. With all my heart. Please don't interrupt me. Come and take your seat here. Keep your fingers from that bitter phalanx of vials. Draw your knitting out of your pocket. That will do. Now continue the history of Mr. Heathcliff, from where you left off to the present day. Did he finish his education on the continent and come back a gentleman? Or did he get a Caesar's place at college, or escape to America and earn honors by drawing blood from his foster country, or make a fortune more promptly on the English highways? He may have done a little in all these vocations, Mr. Lockwood, but I couldn't give my word for any. I stated before that I didn't know how he gained his money. Neither am I aware of the means he took to raise his mind from the savage ignorance into which it was sunk. But with your leave, I'll proceed in my own fashion, if you think it will amuse and not weary you. Are you feeling better this morning? Much. That's good news. I got Miss Catherine and myself to Thrushcross Grange, and to my agreeable disappointment, she behaved infinitely better than I dared to expect. She seemed almost over fond of Mr. Linton, and even to his sister she showed plenty of affection. They were both very attentive to her comfort, certainly. It was not the thorn bending to the honeysuckles, but the honeysuckles embracing the thorn. There were no mutual concessions. One stood erect, and the others yielded. And who can be ill-natured and bad-tempered when they encounter neither opposition nor indifference? I observed that Mr. Edgar had a deep-rooted fear of ruffling her humor. He concealed it from her. But if ever he heard me answer sharply, or saw any other servant grow cloudy at some imperious orders of hers, he would show her his trouble by a frown of displeasure that never darkened on his own account. He many a time spoke sternly to me about my pertness, and averred that the stab of a knife could not inflict a worse pang than he suffered at seeing his lady vexed. Not to grieve a kind master, I learned to be less touchy, and for the space of half a year the gunpowder lay as harmless as sand, because no fire came near to explode it. Catherine had seasons of gloom and silence now and then. They were respected with sympathizing silence by her husband, who ascribed them to an alteration in her constitution produced by her perilous illness, as she was never subject to depression of spirits before. The return of sunshine was welcomed by answering sunshine from him. I believe I may assert that they were really in possession of deep and growing happiness. It ended. Well, we must be for ourselves in the long run. The mild and generous are only more justly selfish than the domineering, and it ended when circumstances caused each to feel that the one's interest was not the chief consideration in the other's thoughts. On a mellow evening in September, I was coming from the garden with the heavy basket of apples which I had been gathering, It had got dusk, and the moon looked over the high wall of the court, causing undefined shadows to lurk in the corners of the numerous projecting portions of the building. I set my burden on the house steps by the kitchen door and lingered to rest, and drew in a few more breaths of the soft, sweet air. My eyes were on the moon and my back to the entrance when I heard a voice behind me say, "Nellie, is that you?" It was a deep voice, and foreign in tone, yet there was something in the manner of pronouncing my name which made it sound familiar. I turned about to discover who spoke fearfully, for the doors were shut, and I had seen nobody on approaching the steps. Something stirred in the porch, and moving nearer, I distinguished a tall man dressed in dark clothes with dark face and hair. He leaned against the side and held his fingers on the latch as if intending to open for himself. Who can it be? I thought. Mr. Earnshaw? Oh no, the voice had no resemblance to his. "I have waited here an hour," he resumed, while I continued staring, "and the whole of that time all round has been as still as death. I dared not enter. You do not know me? Look, I'm not a stranger." A ray fell on his features. The cheeks were sallow and half covered with black whiskers, the brows lowering, the eyes deep set and singular. I remembered the eyes. "What?" I cried, uncertain whether to regard him as a worldly visitor, and I raised my hands in amazement. "What? You come back? Is it really you? Is it?" "Yes, Heathcliff," he replied. "Yes, Heathcliff," he replied, glancing from me up to the windows, which reflected a score of glittering moons, but showed no lights from within. "Are they at home? Where is she, Nellie? You are not glad? You needn't be so disturbed. Is she here? Speak. I want to have a word with her, your mistress. Go and say some person from Gimmerton desires to see her." "How will she take it?" I exclaimed. "What will she do? The surprise bewilders me. It will put her out of her head. And you are Heathcliff, but altered. Nay, there's no comprehending it. Have you been for a soldier?" "Go and carry my message," he interrupted impatiently. "I'm in hell till you do." He lifted the latch, and I entered. But when I got to the parlor where Mr. and Mrs. Linton were, I could not persuade myself to proceed. At length, I resolved on making an excuse to ask if they would have the candles lighted, and I opened the door. They sat together in a window whose lattice lay back against the wall and displayed, beyond the garden trees and the wild green park, the valley of Gimmerton, with the long line of mist winding nearly to its top. For very soon after you pass the chapel, as you may have noticed, the sow that runs from the marshes joins a beck which follows the bend of the glen. Wuthering Heights rose above this silvery vapor, but our old house was invisible. It rather dips down on the other side. Both the room and its occupants and the scene they gazed on looked wondrously peaceful. I shrank reluctantly from performing my errand, and was actually going away, leaving it unsaid after having put my question about the candles, when a sense of my folly compelled me to return and mutter, "A person from Gimmerton wishes to see you, ma'am." "What does he want?" asked Mrs. Linton. I did not question him, I answered. "Well, close the curtains, Nellie," she said, "and bring up tea. I'll be back again directly." She squinted the apartment. Mr. Edgar inquired carelessly who it was. "Someone mistress does not expect," I replied. "That Heathcliff. You recollect him, sir, who used to live at Mr. Earnshaw's?" "What? The gypsy? The ploughboy?" he cried. "Why did you not say so to Catherine?" "Hush, you must not call him by those names, master," I said. "She'd be sadly grieved to hear you. She was nearly heartbroken when he ran off. I guess his return will make a jubilee to her." Mr. Linton walked to a window on the other side of the room that overlooked the court. He unfastened it and leaned out. I suppose they were below, for he exclaimed quickly, "Don't stand there, love. Bring the person in, if it be anyone in particular." Ere long I heard the click of the latch, and Catherine flew upstairs, breathless and wild, too excited to show gladness. Indeed, by her face You would rather have surmised an awful calamity. "Oh, Edgar! Edgar!" she panted, flinging her arms round his neck. "Oh, Edgar, darling, Heathcliff's come back. He is!" And she tightened her embrace to a squeeze. "Well, well," cried her husband crossly, "don't strangle me for that. He never struck me as such a marvelous treasure. There's no need to be frantic." "I know you didn't like him," she answered, repressing a little intensity of her delight. "Yet for my sake you must be friends now. Shall I tell him to come up?" "Here?" he said. "Into the parlor?" "Where else?" she asked. He looked vexed, and suggested the kitchen as a more suitable place for him. Mrs. Linton eyed him with a droll expression, half angry, half laughing at his fastidiousness. "No," she added after a while, "I cannot sit in the kitchen. Set 2 tables here, Ellen, one for your master and Miss Isabella, being gentry, the other for Heathcliff and myself, being of the lower orders. Will that please you, dear? Or must I have a fire lighted elsewhere? If so, give directions. I'll run down and secure my guest. I'm afraid the joy is too great to be real." She was about to dart off again, but Edgar arrested her. "You bid him step up?" he said, addressing me, and Catherine tried to be glad, without being absurd. "The whole household need not witness the sight of your welcoming a runaway servant as a brother." I descended and found Heathcliff waiting upon the porch, evidently anticipating an invitation to enter. He followed my guidance without waste of words, and I ushered him into the presence of the master and mistress, whose flushed cheeks betrayed signs of warm talking. But the ladies glowed with another feeling when her friend appeared at the door. She sprang forward, took both his hands, and led him to Linton, and then she seized Linton's reluctant fingers and crushed them into his. Now fully revealed by the fire and candlelight, I was amazed more than ever to behold the transformation of Heathcliff. He had grown a tall, athletic, well-formed man, beside whom my master seemed quite slender and youth-like. His upright carriage suggested the idea of his having been in the army. His countenance was much older in expression and decision of feature than Mr. Linton's. It looked intelligent, and retained no marks of former degradation. A half-civilized ferocity lurked yet in the depressed brows and eyes full of black fire, but it was subdued, and his manner was even dignified, quite divested of roughness, though too stern for grace. My master's surprise equaled or exceeded mine. He remained for a minute at a loss how to address the ploughboy, as he had called him. Heathcliff dropped his slight hand and stood looking at him coolly till he chose to speak. "Sit down, sir," he said at length. "Mrs. Linton, recalling old times, would have me give you a cordial reception, and of course I am gratified when anything occurs to please her." "And I also," answered Heathcliff, "especially if it be anything in which I have a part. I shall stay an hour or 2 willingly." He took a seat opposite Catherine, who kept her gaze fixed on him as if she feared he would vanish were she to remove it. He did not raise his to her often. A quick glance now and then sufficed, but it flashed back even every time more confidently, the undisguised delight he drank from hers. They were too much absorbed in their mutual joy to suffer embarrassment.